30 years, Americans have explored their past. Its music, literature, art, social conflicts, wars, and major historical figures. He's also brought us constantly into our present. As we watch Prohibition, we ponder the war on drugs. As we look at Dust Bowl, we drift toward thoughts of climate change, the current drought of the Great Plains. From Lewis and Clark to our national parks, from our national pastime, baseball, to American art form, jazz. From the Civil War to the war. Ken Burns has told the stories of America and Americans. Like John Steinbeck, Mr. Burns has also evinced a strong, intuitive, and nuanced sense of the high worth of every human being, what Albert Schweitzer called the reverence for life, within the context of that person's place, his time in history. Steinbeck wrote in the winter of our discontent, "No one really knows about other human beings. The best that he can do is suppose that they are like himself. For all you have done to educate us, and through learning to make us more like the people and the nation that we might one day be, we thank you, Ken, and please accept this token of our esteem."
Let me follow a little bit about the themes that Paul was just suggesting. Ecclesiastes, we're familiar with the more familiar a time for this, a time for that. But there's a passage that said, "What has been will be again, what has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun." In my business, in trying to capture history, it is fashionable to say there are cycles. I do not believe that so. The universe is way too chaotic to have a kind of order. People have said, George Santayana, that we are condemned to repeat what we don't remember. I think it's a nice phrase, but I don't think that's quite true either. I just think that we have a human nature is essentially the same, that we human beings are the same, and particularly in highly politicized times, when we find it impossible to listen to one another, that history becomes a table around which we can have a complicated conversation, that we can recognize in the people before us patterns of their own lives that resonate with our own, the same greed, the same generosity, the same prurience, the same puritanism. All of the things we observe outside ourselves are also mirrored in our complicated past. And having a past permits us to have that present, or at least an awareness of something, the historical ties that have brought us to this moment, and then of course suggest that we might too then have a future. How wonderfully optimistic it is to watch Franklin Roosevelt talk about 10,000 years from now, and I think we'll still be here. If you think about 10,000 years before the moment that he was talking about, human beings were just emerging from prehistoric life. During those 10,000 years, mankind had done extraordinary things and also done horrendous things. But somehow, this patrician to the manor born believed that in 10,000 years, there would be an America, and that we would still be subscribed to the same form of government. And I found that optimism so far thinking that you begin to realize that an investigation of the past isn't a look backwards, but in many cases, a look forwards. And central to its power is this sense of the so-called ordinary person, that it is not entirely all top-down. And I'm interested in that power of history, and I'm interested in its many varied voices, and not just the voices that would suggest that American history is just the story of great men, capital G, and not just those stories that have recently entered our histories, which seem to suggest that American history is only a catalog of white European crimes. I'm interested in listening to the voices of a true, honest, complicated past that is unafraid of controversy or tragedy, but equally drawn to those stories and moments that suggest an abiding faith in the human spirit, and particularly the unique role this remarkable but also sometimes dysfunctional republic plays in the positive progress of mankind. As I think about this, as I think about your kind words, Paul, I also think about my mentor, Jerry Liebling, a social documentary still photographer who died 2 years ago. There is never a moment since 1971 when I met him that he wasn't a mentor and wasn't teaching me, and continues to teach to me still. And he said the same sort of things that animated John Steinbeck. He said, go, see, do, be, the kind of action required not just of artists but of citizens. Go, see, do, be. And I was also, when I read the list of the distinguished people who have received this award, it included another person that I was quite fond of, the playwright Arthur Miller. I had the great good fortune to get to know him in my film on the Brooklyn Bridge. And I interviewed him, and I pestered him for months and months and months to give an interview, and he kept turning me down and saying no. And then he finally relented as much to get me away from him. And I thought, as I drove up to his Connecticut farm with our tiny crew, that I ought to pick up a copy of his play, A View from the Bridge, so that I would be better in asking questions. And along the way, I realized that the play had absolutely nothing to do with the Brooklyn Bridge. I arrived at his Connecticut farm, and this super tall man, 6'5", opened the door and just stared down at me with just blazing anger and said, I don't know a goddamn thing about the Brooklyn Bridge. And I must have looked so mortified and so terrified that he relented. He said, now, come on. And he gestured me around the house. We weren't going to be allowed in his house. And usually we'd spend 2 hours in the library, our favorite chair of the living room, the den, where we'd set up this careful shot, and I would have this whole list of stuff. We didn't have time to load film. The light was leaving this beautiful fall day in 1979, and I had to find an apple crate to get up to his height, but not to his stature. And I don't remember what question that we asked. So we still had only like a minute or two in the film magazine from that morning's interview, but I do remember his answer. It's the only time we have used the entire interview, or the entire answer. He said, you see, the city is fundamentally a practical utilitarian invention. And suddenly you see this steel poetry sticking there, and it's a shock. He really aspired to do something. I mean, he could have built another Manhattan Bridge, but he didn't. He really aspired to do something gorgeous. So it makes you think that maybe you too could add something that would last and be beautiful. That maybe you too could add something that would last and be beautiful. You know, we came back, we put that's the last word of my very first film. I felt in some ways like the young, idealistic Charles Foster Kane who had tacked up his ideals when he and Joseph Cotton had gone into the newspaper business, all to be corrupted, and that was the pole star to be guided to. And when you think about the legacy of John Steinbeck, certainly the legacy of Arthur Miller, of the people we know in our lives who have influenced us, we are ourselves compelled to add something that would last and be beautiful. And I'm so grateful for this recognition this evening. Thank you very much.
thank you all for being part of this wonderful evening. It would be remiss of me if I did not thank the permanent director of the Steinbeck Center, Nick Taylor, who's here with his wife, Jessica. And I am thanking him for letting me pitch hit and be part of this. It's such a wonderful gift. Nick is on sabbatical leave, writing and taking care, along with Jessica, of his brand new twin babies. So thank you, Nick, and Godspeed. Have a great sabbatical. And all of you, go forth, do, and be.